The morning sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple as Richard Chen parked his sleek black car at the cemetery entrance. He sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the polished hood. 10 years. It had been 10 years since his father's passing, yet the weight of their last conversation still pressed heavily on his chest. Richard adjusted his tie and glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. At 45, his once jet-black hair now showed threads of silver at the temples. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, evidence of both stress and success. As the CEO of Phoenix Innovations, he had transformed his father's modest electronics repair shop into a tech empire valued at billions. Yet here, among the quiet graves, none of that seemed to matter. He stepped out of the car, the morning dew dampening the soles of his Italian leather shoes as he walked the familiar path. The cemetery was peaceful at this hour, just the way he preferred it. No business calls, no board meetings, no assistants hovering with tablets full of problems requiring immediate attention. Just silence and the weight of memories. Richard had made this pilgrimage every year on the anniversary of his father's death. Their relationship had been complicated, filled with high expectations, harsh criticisms, and rare moments of approval that Richard had clung to like precious gems. Their last conversation had been an argument about the direction of the company. His father, stubborn as always, refused to embrace Richard's vision for expansion. Words were exchanged, doors were slammed, and 3 days later his father was gone, a sudden heart attack that left no time for apologies or reconciliation. "I did it, Dad," Richard whispered to himself as he walked. "Everything I said I would do. Everything you said couldn't be done." The words felt hollow, as they always did. What was the point of proving yourself right to someone who wasn't there to see it? As he rounded the bend where the oak trees gave way to rows of polished granite markers, Richard stopped abruptly. There, kneeling before his father's grave, was a small figure, a boy perhaps 6 or 7 years old, carefully arranging a small bouquet of wildflowers beside the headstone. Richard frowned. Who was this child? And why was he at his father's grave? He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy but curious about the unexpected visitor. The boy didn't notice Richard's approach. He was too busy making sure each flower was perfectly placed. Richard could now see the child was wearing a slightly oversized blue button-up shirt, tucked neatly into khaki pants. Dressed up for this visit, it seemed. Then the boy began to speak to the grave in a soft, clear voice that carried in the morning stillness. "Good morning, Grandpa," the boy said. "Mom says it's important to keep talking to you even though you're in heaven now. I brought your favorite flowers today. The lady at the flower shop helped me pick the yellow ones because I told her they were for someone special." Richard froze mid-step. Grandpa? This child was calling his father Grandpa? That wasn't possible. Richard had no children, no siblings. His father had no other grandchildren. "School is going well," the boy continued, unaware of Richard's presence. "I got a gold star on my science project. It was about circuits just like you used to make. Dad showed me your old notebooks before he got sick. I couldn't understand all the drawings, but Dad said someday I would." Richard's mind raced. Who was this boy's father? And how did he know Richard's father well enough for the boy to call him Grandpa? The boy sighed, a sound too heavy for someone so young. "I miss Dad a lot. Mom says it's okay to be sad, but that I should also remember the happy things. Dad always said you were the smartest person he ever met. He said you taught him everything important." The boy traced the engraved letters on the headstone with his small fingers. "I wish I could have met you. Dad said we would have gotten along great because we both like to figure out how things work." Richard stood frozen, unable to move forward or retreat. The boy's words had stirred something inside him. Confusion, certainly, but also an unexpected ache. This child spoke of his father with such familiarity, such affection. It was as if they were talking about two different men. Finally, a twig snapped beneath Richard's foot, and the boy's head whipped around. Their eyes met, the child's wide with surprise, Richard's narrowed with confusion. "Oh, Hello, the boy said, quickly standing and brushing dirt from his knees. Are you here to visit Mr. Chen too? Richard swallowed hard. Yes, he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. He was my father. The boy's eyes grew even wider. Your father? He repeated, looking from Richard to the grave and back. Again. Then his face lit up with recognition. Oh, are you Mr. Richard? The one who builds the big buildings and makes the phones? Despite himself, Richard felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. I don't actually build the buildings myself, he said. But yes, my company makes phones and other electronics. The boy nodded solemnly. Dad had one of your phones. He said it was the best one ever made. Richard took a step closer, still trying to piece together this puzzle. And who is your dad? His name is Tom, the boy said, a shadow crossing his face. Thomas Lee. But he's in heaven now too. He got very sick last year. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Tom Lee. Of course. His father's protege. The brilliant young man who had worked alongside his father for years. Richard had met him only a handful of times, usually during brief visits to the shop before he'd moved the company headquarters across town. Tom had been quiet, dedicated, with a mind that seemed to grasp complex problems instantly. His father had spoken highly of him, more highly, it sometimes seemed, than he ever spoke of his own son. And you are? Richard asked, his voice gentler now. My name is Peter, the boy said, extending his hand with surprising formality. Peter Lee. I'm 7.5. Richard carefully shook the small hand. It's nice to meet you, Peter. I'm Richard. Chen. Peter nodded. I know. Dad had your picture from a magazine. He said you were very important. Richard felt an uncomfortable mix of emotions swirling within him. Pride, sadness, and a strange sense of inadequacy. This boy knew who he was, but Richard hadn't even known of Peter's existence. How did you get here this morning, Peter? Richard asked, suddenly realizing that a young child shouldn't be alone in a cemetery. Mom brought me, Peter explained, pointing toward the cemetery entrance. She's getting more water for the flowers. We come every month, but today is special, because it's been exactly 10 years since Grandpa Chen went to heaven. Richard was struck by the realization that this boy and his mother had been making regular visits to his father's grave, possibly for years, while he only managed to come once a year, and they called him Grandpa Chen, suggesting a closeness that Richard himself had never felt with his father. Your dad and my father were close? Richard asked, though it wasn't really a question. Peter nodded enthusiastically. The best of friends. Dad said Grandpa Chen taught him everything about electronics and about being a good person. He said Grandpa Chen gave him chances nobody else would. Before Richard could respond, he heard quick footsteps approaching. A woman hurried toward them, her face etched with concern that melted into alarm when she saw Richard standing with her son. Peter, I told you to stay where I could see you, she called out, her pace quickening. As she drew closer, Richard recognized her. Not from personal acquaintance, but from the single photograph his father had kept on his workbench, a group photo from some company picnic years ago. She had been standing next to Tom, both of them smiling broadly, his father's arm around Tom's shoulder in a gesture of pride that Richard couldn't remember ever being directed at him. The woman reached them, slightly out of breath, and protectively put her hand on Peter's shoulder. I'm sorry if he was bothering you, she began, then stopped short as she got a better look at Richard's face. Recognition dawned in her eyes. You're Richard Chen, she said quietly. Richard nodded, suddenly feeling like an intruder despite the fact that this was his father's grave. And you are? Linda Lee, she said. Tom's wife. We didn't expect to see you here today. The implication hung in the air. They had been coming here for years and had never encountered him before. An awkward silence fell over them, broken only by Peter's innocent voice. Mom, Mr. Richard is Grandpa Chen's real son, and he makes the phones that Dad liked. Linda gave her son a gentle smile before looking back at Richard, uncertainty in her eyes. We can come back another time, she offered. Richard found himself shaking his head. No, he said, surprising himself. Please, stay. I think we have a lot to talk about. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds, Richard Chen stood at his father's grave with two strangers who somehow knew a side of his father he had never seen. For the first time in 10 years, he felt something shift inside him. Not closure exactly, but the opening of a door he hadn't known existed. Linda suggested they move to a nearby bench beneath an old maple tree. The cemetery was still, quiet, with only a groundskeeper visible in the distance, riding a small mower between the farther rows of headstones. Richard sat somewhat stiffly, his expensive suit looking out of place against the weathered wooden bench. Peter settled between the adults, swinging his legs that didn't quite reach the ground. "How long did you work with my father?" Richard asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Linda glanced at her son before answering. Tom started at Chen Electronics when he was just 19. He worked there for 11 years, right until... She paused, looking down at her hands. "Until your father passed away." Richard tried to recall if he'd ever had a real conversation with Tom during those years. He remembered a quiet young man who always seemed to be hunched over a workbench whenever Richard visited the shop, which wasn't often. His father had mentioned Tom occasionally, usually when comparing his dedication to Richard's wasteful business school ideas. "Your husband was very talented," Richard said. "My father spoke highly of him." Linda smiled softly. Mr. Chen was like a father to Tom. His own parents died when he was young, and he was raised by an aunt who... She glanced at Peter, carefully, choosing her words, who wasn't very supportive. "Your father gave him more than just a job. He gave him direction, purpose." Peter looked up at Richard with curious eyes. "Dad said Grandpa Chen could fix anything. Once he fixed our toaster with just a paperclip and some tape." Despite himself, Richard smiled. That sounded like his father. Practical to a fault, always finding simple solutions to complex problems. It was one of the many things they had argued about over the years. Richard wanted to innovate, to create new products. His father was content fixing what was already broken. "What happened after my father died?" Richard asked. "Did Tom stay with the company?" Linda's expression clouded. "No. When Phoenix Innovations took over, the repair shop was closed. Everything moved to the new headquarters across town." Richard felt a twinge of discomfort. He hadn't considered what had happened to his father's employees after the transition. The old shop had seemed like such a small part of his vision for the company that he'd delegated the details of the closure to his management team. "Tom tried to apply for a position at the new location," Linda continued, "but they said he didn't have the right qualifications. No degree, you know." The discomfort in Richard's chest grew sharper. He'd insisted on hiring only people with formal education in the early days of expansion, convinced it was the only way to compete with the bigger players in the industry. "What did he do then?" Richard asked, already feeling he knew the answer. "He opened his own little repair shop," Linda said, a hint of pride warming her voice. "Nothing fancy, just a small place downtown. He named it Chen and Lee Electronics in honor of your father." Richard blinked in surprise. "I never knew that." "It did well enough," Linda said. "Tom was good at what he did. People would bring him things that other repair shops had given up on. He could almost always fix them." Peter nodded enthusiastically. "Dad could fix anything, just like Grandpa Chen taught him. He let me watch sometimes. He said I have the eyes for it." Richard studied the boy more carefully. There was something in his focused gaze that reminded him of his father, a quiet intensity, an attention to detail. "We still have the shop," Linda said. "I've been trying to keep it running since Tom passed away, but..." She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. It was a struggle. How did Tom... Richard hesitated, unsure how to ask about the boy's father's death in front of him. Linda seemed to understand. "Cancer," she said softly. "It started in his lungs and spread quickly. The doctors said it might have been from years of breathing in soldering fumes without proper ventilation." Richard winced. His father had always been careless about such things, working in poorly ventilated spaces, dismissing Richard's concerns about workplace safety as unnecessary expenses. "I'm sorry," Richard said and meant it. Peter, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Dad wasn't scared, though. He said he'd get to see Grandpa Chen again. He told me not to be sad because someday, a long, long time from now, we'd all be together." Linda brushed her hand gently over her son's hair, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Before he passed," she said to Richard, "Tom wrote letters for Peter to open on important birthdays. He also left him a special box of things that had belonged to your father." "My father's things?" Richard asked, surprised. Linda nodded. "When they closed the shop, your father's desk was going to be thrown away. Tom asked if he could keep it and some of the tools and books inside. No one seemed to care, so he took them. I hope that was okay." Richard felt a strange mixture of emotions. He'd cleared out his father's house after the funeral, but had left the shop's contents to be dealt with by the transition team. He'd never thought to ask about personal items that might have been there. "Of course it's okay," he said. "I'm glad someone saved those things." Peter tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Would you like to see them?" Dad said they were important history. Before Richard could answer, Linda quickly intervened. "Peter, Mr. Chen is a very busy man. I'm sure he has other places to be today." Richard glanced at his watch. He did have a board meeting at 11 and a lunch with potential investors after that. His assistant would be frantically trying to reach him by now, but something kept him rooted to the bench. "Actually," he said, surprising himself, "I'd like that very much. The meeting can wait." Peter's face lit up. "Really? Can we show him? Mom, please?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Our apartment isn't far from here if you're sure you have the time." 20 minutes later, Richard found himself following Linda's modest sedan in his luxury car, heading toward a part of the city he rarely visited. The neighborhood wasn't exactly run down, but it was certainly working class. Small apartment, buildings interspersed with family-owned businesses, many with signs in both English and Chinese. They parked on the street, and Richard followed Linda and Peter up 3 flights of stairs to a small but tidy apartment. The living room doubled as a dining area, with a round table covered in school books and drawing paper. Photos of Tom and Peter covered one wall, charting the boys' growth from infancy to present day. In several of the pictures, Richard could see his father's workbench in the background, unchanged from his memories. "The box is in my closet," Peter announced importantly. "Mom says I can't play with the tools yet, but I can look at the books anytime I want." While Peter ran to his room, Linda gestured for Richard to sit at the small table. "Can I get you some tea?" she offered, the traditional hospitality seeming to come automatically despite the unusual circumstances. "Yes, thank you," Richard said, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit among the modest but homey surroundings. Peter returned, carefully carrying a wooden box with Chinese characters burned into the lid. Richard recognized it immediately. His father had made similar boxes for storing special tools, a skill he'd learned from his own father, a carpenter. "Dad said this was Grandpa Chen's treasure box," Peter explained, setting it gently on the Yao table and opening the lid. Inside, nestled in a red cloth, were various small tools: precision screwdrivers, specialized pliers, a magnifying glass with a rosewood handle that Richard remembered from his childhood. Beneath these was a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellow with age. "This is the most special," Peter said, carefully lifting out the notebook. "Dad said it has all of Grandpa Chen's secrets." Richard accepted the notebook with unexpectedly trembling hands. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately, neat, precise characters filling page after page. There were circuit diagrams, repair notes, and occasional personal observations about particularly challenging fixes. It was a record of his father's life work, the accumulation of decades of practical knowledge. As he turned the pages, something fell out. A photograph. Richard picked it up and felt his breath catch. It was a picture of himself at his college graduation, standing proudly in his cap and gown. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were the words, "My son Richard, the first Chen to graduate, University, May 2003. Linda, who had returned with the tea, saw the photograph and smiled softly. He was very proud of you. He showed that picture to Tom many times. Richard swallowed hard. He never told me that. Tom said your father talked about you all the time. Linda continued, pouring the tea. He kept newspaper clippings whenever your company was mentioned. When Phoenix Innovations won that big government contract 5 years ago, he brought champagne to the shop to celebrate. Richard stared at her in disbelief. He did, but he told me that contract was a mistake, that I was expanding too quickly, taking too many risks. Linda shrugged. Maybe he worried as a father but was proud as a bystander. Parents are complicated that way. Peter, who had been quietly arranging the tools from the box, looked up. Dad said Grandpa Chen was the smartest but also the stubbornest person he ever met. Is stubborn a bad thing? Richard found himself laughing, a genuine laugh that surprised him. Not always, he said. Sometimes being stubborn is the only way to get important things done. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Richard sat at the small table sipping tea and looking through his father's notebook, while Peter eagerly explained what he knew about each tool. The board meeting came and went without him, but for the first time in years, Richard didn't care about business obligations. Here, in this modest apartment surrounded by his father's treasured possessions and people who had genuinely loved him, Richard felt he was finally beginning to understand the man his father had really been. Richard's phone had been buzzing insistently in his pocket for the past hour. Finally, with an apologetic smile to Linda and Peter, he stepped into the hallway to answer it. Where are you? His assistant's voice was tight with stress. The board is furious. The investors have been waiting for 40 minutes. Richard gazed, back through the doorway at Peter, who was carefully returning his grandfather's tools to their box. Something important came up, he said. Family business, reschedule everything for tomorrow. But Sir, Mr. Nakamura flew in from Tokyo specifically for this meeting. Then put him up in the best hotel in the city and send a gift basket. With my apologies, Richard interrupted. Tell him I had an unexpected family situation that couldn't be postponed. For once, it wasn't even a lie. When he returned to the apartment, Linda was clearing away the teacups. You probably need to go, she said. We've taken up enough of your time. Richard shook his head. Actually, I've cleared my schedule. He hesitated, then added, If you don't mind, I'd like to see Tom's repair shop. The one he named after my father. Linda looked surprised but nodded. Of course. Peter and I go there every Saturday to clean up and check on things. We've been trying to keep it running with help from Mr. Wong. He was Tom's assistant, but it's been difficult. Can we go now? Richard asked. 20 minutes later, they pulled up in front of a narrow storefront wedged between a noodle shop and a small grocery store. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Chen and Lee Electronics in both English and Chinese characters. Below that, in smaller lettering, If it can be fixed, we can fix it. Peter ran ahead with a key, proudly unlocking the front door. Inside, the shop was small but meticulously organized. A counter ran along one side with a glass display case showing various electronic components. The back wall was lined with shelves holding devices in various states of repair, each with a tag noting the owner's name and the issue to be fixed. Richard walked slowly around the space, taking it all in. The setup was remarkably similar to his father's original shop, the one where Richard had spent countless hours as a child, watching his father work before their relationship had soured during his teenage years. Tom wanted it to feel like your father's place, Linda explained, watching Richard's reaction. He said the layout had perfect flow for this kind of work. In the back corner was a workbench bathed in natural light from a small window. Tools were arranged with precision on a pegboard above it, outlines drawn around each one so they would always be returned to the correct spot. Another of his father's habits. This is where Dad did the really hard fixes, Peter said, climbing onto the tall stool in front of the bench. He let me watch if I promised not to touch anything and stayed super quiet. Richard noticed a framed photograph on the wall beside the workbench. It showed his father and a much younger Tom, both grinning broadly and holding up what appeared to be some kind of modified circuit board. Their first patent, Linda said, following his gaze. A repair solution for a common problem with old television sets. They licensed it to a parts manufacturer. It didn't make much money, but your father was so proud that they'd created something new instead of just fixing what others had made. Richard stepped closer to examine the photo. I never knew my father held any patents. 3, actually, Linda said. All with Tom as co-inventor. There's a drawer with all the documentation somewhere. As if suddenly remembering something, she walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. After rifling through several folders, she extracted a thick envelope. This is for you, she said, holding it out to Richard. Tom wanted to give it to you himself someday, but he never got the chance. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to get it to you. Richard accepted the envelope with a questioning look. It's a letter, Linda explained. And some other things Tom thought you should have. Richard carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several folded papers. The top one was a handwritten letter on the shop's letterhead. Dear Mr. Richard Chen, if you're reading this, it means I've passed away before getting the chance to speak with you in person. I've been meaning to reach out for years, but never found the right moment or courage to do so. Your father, Mr. Chen, was the most important person in my life aside from my wife and son. He took me in when I was just a lost kid with a knack for fixing things and nowhere to go. He not only taught me a trade, but showed me what it meant to live with integrity and purpose. He spoke of you often, and always with great pride. I know, you two had your differences. He mentioned the arguments about the direction of the business, but I want you to know that he understood your vision even when he disagreed with it. My son sees the future, he would say. I only see what's broken in front of me. When your company began to grow and receive recognition, he would bring in newspapers and magazines with your picture or mentions of Phoenix innovations. He kept a scrapbook of your accomplishments that he would show me and later my son, Peter. Look at what my Richard has built, he would say. The last time I saw your father alive, he asked me to promise him something. He was worried about the friction between you two and regretted his stubbornness. He asked me to tell you if I ever got the chance that he was sorry for not supporting your dreams more fully. A father should lift his son up, not hold him back, were his exact words. Enclosed with this letter are several items I think you should have. The patent documents we worked on together, some photographs he kept in his desk, and most importantly, the last birthday card you sent him. He carried it in his wallet every day. Your father's legacy lives on not just in the success of Phoenix Innovations, but in the values he instilled in those around him. My son Peter calls him Grandpa Chen, because that's how I always referred to him as the father I never had but always needed. I hope someday our paths might cross, and I could tell you in person how much your father loved you, even when he couldn't find the words to say it. With deepest respect, Thomas Lee Richards. Hands trembled as he set the letter down. He pulled out the other contents of the envelope, the patent certificates with both his father's and Tom's names, several yellowed newspaper clippings about Phoenix Innovations' early successes, and finally, a worn birthday card. He recognized it immediately. It was the last card he'd sent before their final argument, a simple card with a fishing theme, because his father had always talked about taking up fishing when he retired. Inside, Richard had written a brief message. Happy birthday, Dad. Maybe this year we can finally take that fishing trip. Richard. They never had. Linda watched as Richard carefully returned the items to the envelope, his face unreadable. There's one more thing, she said quietly. In the back room. She led him through a door behind the counter. The small room beyond served as both an office and a storage area. A desk was pushed against one wall, covered with paperwork and receipts. But what caught Richard's eye was in the corner. A workbench with an unfinished project spread across, it surrounded by notes and diagrams. This was Tom's last project, Linda explained. He was working on it right up until he became too weak to come to the shop anymore. Richard approached the bench and examined the device. It appeared to be some kind of medical monitor, but with modifications he didn't recognize. What is it? He asked. Peter, who had followed them into the room, piped up. Dad called it the early warn. It's supposed to detect cancer cells before they get too big. Linda placed her hand on her son's shoulder. Tom's doctor told us that if they'd caught his cancer earlier, he might have had a better chance. It got Tom thinking about all the people who don't get regular checkups or can't afford fancy medical tests. He wanted to create something affordable that could give early warnings. Richard leaned closer to examine the prototype. Despite his years of experience with electronics, the design was unlike anything he'd seen before. He combined ideas from several different technologies. Linda continued. The basic concept was to adapt existing medical sensors into something that could be mass-produced cheaply. He said the hard part wasn't the technology, but making it affordable enough for regular people. Richard carefully picked up one of Tom's notebooks and flipped through it. The technical drawings were meticulous, but what struck him were the notes in the margins. Remember Mr. Chen's approach: simplify, don't complicate, and what would Mr. Chen do here? How far did he get with this? Richard asked, a strange excitement building inside him. Linda sighed. The prototype works in basic lab conditions, but it needs refinement and proper testing. Mr. Wong has tried to continue the work, but without Tom's full vision. She shrugged helplessly. We don't have the resources or connections to take it further. Richard set down the notebook and turned to face Linda, his mind suddenly clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I think, he said slowly, that Phoenix Innovations might be interested in helping develop this project. Linda's eyes widened. What? But why would a big company like yours care about Tom's little project? Richard looked around the small shop that bore his father's name, at the boy who called his father Grandpa, at the unfinished device that could potentially save lives. Because it matters, he said simply, and because I think it's what my father would have wanted. For the first time since entering his father's grave that morning, Richard felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. In this unlikely place, surrounded by strangers who had somehow become connected to him through his father, he felt he was finally beginning to understand what truly mattered. Not the empire he had built, but the legacy of relationships his father had cultivated while he wasn't looking. Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself drawn back to the small repair shop again and again. His executive team was baffled by his sudden interest in a minor medical project and his insistence on personally overseeing its development. His assistant had to rearrange his carefully structured calendar to accommodate his frequent absences from the corporate headquarters. I don't understand, his chief financial officer complained during a board meeting. We have a dozen more profitable ventures in our development pipeline. Why are we suddenly prioritizing this unproven device from an unknown source? Richard, who would have agreed with this assessment just a month ago, found himself uncharacteristically passionate in his response. Because this isn't just about profit, he said firmly. It's about purpose. The boardroom fell silent. In 15 years of leadership, Richard had never spoken about purpose over profit. After the meeting, Richard drove straight to Chen & Lee Electronics. The shop was closed to customers on Mondays, but Linda had given him a key. Inside, he found Mr. Wong, a slender man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, working diligently at Tom's workbench. Any progress? Richard asked, setting down his briefcase. Mr. Wong looked up and shook his head. The sensor calibration is still off. We need more specialized equipment to get the accuracy where it needs to be. Richard nodded. I've arranged for some equipment to be delivered tomorrow, and I'm bringing in Dr. Huang from our research division to consult. Mr. Wong's eyes widened. Dr. Huang was a well-known figure in medical technology innovation. That's very generous, Mr. Chen. Richard waved away the comment. It's not generosity. It's investment in something worthwhile. The bell above the door jingled as Linda and Peter entered. Peter was still in his school uniform, backpack slung over one shoulder. Mr. Richard. The boy's face lit up. You came again. Richard couldn't help but smile. There was something about Peter's enthusiasm that cut through the usual formality people showed around him because of his wealth and position. I told you I would, he said, reaching into his briefcase. And I brought something for you. He pulled out a small box and handed it to Peter. Inside was a set of precision screwdrivers sized for smaller hands but made with the same quality as professional tools. Your own set, Richard explained. If you're going to learn electronics, you should have proper tools. Peter looked up with wonder. Really? I can keep these? Linda frowned slightly. That's very kind, but they look expensive. Every good technician needs their own tools, Richard said firmly. My father gave me my first set when I was about Peter's age. The memory surfaced unexpectedly, his father presenting him with a similar kit on his 8th birthday, showing him how to hold each tool properly. Thank you. Peter carefully examined each screwdriver, his face serious with responsibility. There's one condition, Richard added. Mr. Wong has agreed to give you proper lessons on how to use them safely. You only use them when he or your mother says it's okay. Deal? Peter nodded solemnly. Deal. While Peter started his first lesson, with Mr. Wong at a separate workbench set up just for him, Richard showed Linda the preliminary development plan he'd created for Tom's device. Phoenix Innovations would partner with Chen & Lee Electronics, he explained. We'd provide the resources and expertise to develop, test, and eventually manufacture the device, but the patent would remain jointly owned. Linda studied the document, with a mixture of hope and wariness. This is more than I expected. But why would your company agree to this arrangement? We don't have anything to offer except Tom's unfinished idea. Richard considered his answer carefully. Sometimes the value of an idea goes beyond its immediate financial potential. This device could help countless people if we can make it work. And he hesitated. I think both our husbands would want us to try. Linda's eyes softened. You're different than I expected, she admitted. Tom always said your father described you as brilliant but driven mainly by business concerns. Richard winced slightly. That was probably accurate for many years. I was so focused on proving myself, on building something impressive, that I lost sight of what really mattered to my father. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself spending more and more time at the small shop. He moved some of his work, there setting up a laptop in the back office. His corporate team was instructed to contact him there, rather than expecting him to return to headquarters for routine matters. The shop became a strange sort of second home. Richard found himself enjoying the simpler surroundings, the focus on practical problems rather than market strategies and profit margins. He started joining Linda and Peter for dinner occasionally, at first because meetings about the project ran late, but later simply because he enjoyed their company. One evening, after a promising breakthrough with the prototype, Richard stayed, behind after the others had left. He sat at his father's old desk, now Tom's and temporarily his, and tried to imagine his father working there, teaching Tom, talking about Richard with pride rather than disappointment. On impulse, he opened the desk drawers, searching for more connections to his father. In the back of the bottom drawer, he found a small wooden box he hadn't seen before. Inside was a collection of odd items: a faded baseball ticket, a small jade turtle, a broken watch, and at the bottom, a yellowed envelope. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter that had never been sent. Richard's heart jumped when he recognized his father's handwriting. Dear Richard, I'm writing this letter on the day of your company's public launch. I watched you on television today, speaking confidently about your vision for Phoenix Innovations. Tom was here with me at the shop and we toasted your success with the good tea I save for special occasions. There are things I should have told you years ago, things a father should say to his son. I was wrong to fight against your vision for the business. I was afraid of change and too stubborn to admit that your path forward was better than the one I had chosen. Fear makes fools of wise men, and pride keeps fools from admitting their mistakes. Tom tells me I should call you, that it's never too late to mend what's broken between us. Perhaps he's right. He's a good boy. Reminds me of you at that age. Curious, determined, but with a gentleness I sometimes worried would make life harder for you in this harsh world. I've kept every newspaper article about your successes. The Boy who came to the shop today asked if you were my son, and I felt such pride saying yes. Strange how easily I can say that to a stranger, but not to you. Maybe tomorrow I'll find the courage to send this letter, or better yet, to call you. To tell you that despite our differences, I have always been proud to be your father. Until then, Dad. The letter was dated just 2 days before his father's death. Richard sat in the quiet shop, the letter trembling in his hands, as the full weight of missed opportunities and unspoken words pressed down on him. His father had been reaching toward reconciliation, but time had run out. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Linda stood in the doorway looking apologetic. Sorry to disturb you. Peter forgot his homework, she explained, then paused, noticing his expression. Are you all right? Richard carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I found a letter my father wrote but never sent. He was going to reach out to me to reconcile, but then he died. Linda's face softened with understanding. I'm sorry. All these years, Richard said quietly, I thought he died disappointed in me, in my choices. I thought he never understood why I needed to build something bigger than a repair shop. Tom always said your father was a man who felt deeply but spoke simply, Linda offered. He didn't have words for complex emotions. Richard nodded, remembering his father's typical responses to any situation. Practical advice, occasional criticism, rare and brief praise, never long conversations about feelings or relationships. Peter asked me something interesting today, Linda said, changing the subject gently. He wanted to know if you could come to his school next week. They're having a Bring Someone You Admire day, and he asked if you would come. Richard looked up in surprise. Me? Not Mr. Wong? Linda smiled. He admires Mr. Wong, but he's fascinated by you. He says you're like his grandpa, but also different, that you can fix things but also build new things. Plus, she added with a slight laugh, he's a little proud to know someone whose picture is in his science textbook. For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. The idea that he had somehow become important to this boy, his father's grandson in all but blood, touched something deep inside him. I'd be honored, he finally said, if you're sure it's appropriate. Very sure, Linda said firmly. You've become important to us, Richard, not because of your company or your money, but because of who you are and your connection to the two, men we both loved. As Linda left with Peter's forgotten homework, Richard remained at the desk, the letter still in his hand. Outside, the city continued its usual evening rhythm, but inside the small repair shop, something had shifted. The past and present seemed to connect in a way he'd never expected, offering a chance to heal old wounds and create something new. For the first time, Richard fully understood what his father had tried to teach him, that the most important things we build aren't companies or products, but relationships that last beyond our own lives. 8 months had passed since that chance meeting at the cemetery. The seasons had changed twice, summer heat giving way to autumn crispness, then winter's chill, and now the first hints of spring were emerging across the city. Richard stood in the lobby of Phoenix Innovations headquarters, surrounded by reporters and cameras. Beside him, looking both nervous and proud, stood Linda, Peter, and Mr. Wong. A large banner hung behind them. Introducing Early Warn, affordable early detection technology for all. Today marks a new direction for Phoenix Innovations, Richard announced to the gathered crowd. With the launch of the Early Warn device, we're not just entering the medical technology sector. We're fulfilling a promise to make life-saving early detection accessible to everyone regardless of income or access to healthcare. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Chen, industry analysts are questioning this pricing model. The profit margin is significantly lower than your company's usual standards. Is this a temporary marketing strategy? Richard shook his head. It's not a strategy. It's a mission. The Early Warn was never designed to maximize profits. It was designed to save lives. He glanced at Peter, who was watching him with wide, attentive eyes. Some things are more important than money. Another reporter jumped in. Sources say this project came from a small repair shop rather than your R&D department. Can you explain the unusual development path? Richard nodded. The original concept was developed by Thomas Lee, a brilliant self-taught engineer who sadly passed away before seeing his vision completed. His work was continued through a partnership between Phoenix Innovations and Chen and Lee Electronics, the shop he founded. He gestured toward Linda and Mr. Wong. This partnership represents the best of both worlds, innovative thinking combined with corporate resources. After the press conference, as the executives and media representatives mingled over refreshments, Richard found Peter examining the display model of the early worn device. "What do you think?" Richard asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "Does it look like your dad's original design?" Peter tilted his head, studying the sleek device. "It's prettier now, but Mom says the inside is still Dad's idea." "That's exactly right," Richard agreed. "We made it look nicer and work better, but the heart of it, the really important part, that's all your dad's creation." Peter nodded solemnly, then looked up at Richard with earnest eyes. "Do you think Dad and Grandpa Chen can see it from heaven?" The question caught Richard off guard. He wasn't a religious man and had never given much thought to afterlife concepts. But looking at Peter's hopeful face, he found himself wanting to believe it was possible. "I think they'd be very proud," he said carefully, "of the device and especially of you." Later that evening, after the excitement of the day had settled, Richard invited Linda and Peter to dinner at his home, something he'd never done before. His penthouse apartment had always been a private retreat, a showcase of his success filled with expensive art and designer furniture that he rarely took time to enjoy. Seeing it now through their eyes, he realized how cold and impersonal it felt, compared to their small but warmly decorated apartment. Peter walked around wide-eyed, asking about the paintings and sculptures, while Linda seemed slightly uncomfortable among the obvious displays of wealth. "I've never actually cooked here," Richard admitted as he showed them the pristine kitchen, with its unused high-end appliances. "Usually I just order in or eat at restaurants." "Never?" Peter asked, shocked at the idea of a kitchen going unused. Linda smiled. "Why don't we cook together tonight? I noticed a grocery store on the corner downstairs." An hour later, Richard found himself chopping vegetables under Linda's patient guidance, while Peter carefully set the table. The simple activity felt strangely satisfying, creating something together, making his sterile kitchen feel lived in for the first time. Over dinner, Peter chatted excitedly about his science project and how his teacher had been impressed that he knew about circuit boards. "Mr. Wong says I have natural talent," he announced proudly, "just like Dad and Grandpa Chen." Richard smiled. "He's right. I've seen how quickly you learn." After Peter had gone to examine Richard's collection of gadgets in the living room, Linda said quietly, "You've changed his life, you know. Given him a connection to his heritage and a path forward." Richard shook his head. "If anything, he's changed mine. Before I met you both, my life was just about business, making things bigger, more profitable, more impressive. I'd forgotten what my father tried to teach me about making things better, not just bigger." "And have you found it?" Linda asked. "Whatever you were looking for." Richard considered the question. "I'm not sure I knew what I was looking for, but I found something I didn't know I needed, a sense of purpose beyond success, a connection to my father's legacy that I thought was lost." He paused. "And people who see me as Richard, not just as the CEO of Phoenix Innovations." The evening ended with a promise to make these dinners a regular occurrence. As Richard watched their taxi pull away from his building, he felt a sense of contentment that had nothing to do with business achievements or financial statements. The next morning, Richard woke early with a sudden clarity about something he needed to do. He made several phone calls, arranged for his driver, and sent a brief message to Linda asking for her and Peter's company later that day. By afternoon, they stood together in the peaceful cemetery where their story had begun. Richard held a bouquet of wildflowers similar to those Peter had placed on his grandfather's grave that first day. "I had a thought this morning," Richard explained as they walked along the now familiar path. "About family and legacies and what we leave behind. They reached his father's grave, but Richard continued walking to the plot beside it, where a new headstone had been installed. Thomas Lee's name was engraved in the polished granite, along with the dates of his birth and death, and beneath that, beloved husband, father, and innovator. Linda gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. "I hope this is okay," Richard said, suddenly uncertain. "I should have asked first, but I wanted it to be a surprise." "It's more than okay," Linda whispered, tears filling her eyes. "But how did you arrange this so quickly?" Richard looked slightly embarrassed. "When you're willing to pay enough, things can happen very quickly. I wanted them to be together, like they would have wanted." Peter stepped forward and placed his small hand on his father's headstone. "Now Dad and Grandpa Chen can talk all the time," he said with the simple wisdom of children. As Linda placed fresh flowers on both graves, Richard felt a sense of completion, of circles closing, and new ones beginning. The device that Tom had started and Richard had helped finish was now ready to go out into the world. Two men who had never properly reconciled in life were now reunited in death, and the boy who had innocently brought them all together was now a living bridge between past and future. "There's one more thing," Richard said as they walked back toward the cemetery gates. He handed Linda an envelope. "The papers establishing the Chen Li Innovation Foundation. It will provide scholarships for talented young people without formal education to develop their ideas, with mentorship from top engineers." Linda opened the envelope, her eyes widening as she scanned the document. "Richard, the funding amount is $10 million to start," Richard said matter-of-factly. "Both our husbands had brilliant minds but limited opportunities because of their backgrounds. I want to change that for others." "Will you help pick the scholars?" Peter asked, having followed enough of the conversation to grasp its meaning. Richard smiled. "I was hoping we all would. You, your mom, me, and Mr. Wang. We each bring different perspectives on what makes a good inventor." As they left the cemetery, the spring sunshine warming their faces, Richard felt his phone vibrate with messages. From the office, questions about the product launch, requests for meetings, all the endless demands of running a global company. For the first time in his career, he switched the phone off without checking the messages. Some things could wait. Right now, he was having lunch with his family. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Richard once again stood at his father's grave. But this time, he wasn't alone. Linda stood beside him, her hand in his, while Peter darted around taking photos of butterflies with the camera Richard had given him for his 8th birthday. "Do you think this is strange?" Richard asked quietly. "Us, I mean? How we started?" Linda shook her head. "I think it's exactly what both of them would have wanted." Richard nodded, remembering the unsent letter, the newspaper clippings, the pride his father had felt but never expressed directly. He thought about Tom, who had kept his father's memory alive and created a bridge between them even after death. "You?" "No," he said, watching Peter carefully approach a butterfly. "I used to think legacy was about buildings with your name on them, or companies that outlived you." "And now?" Linda asked. Richard gestured toward Peter. "Now I think it's about the connections we leave behind, the lives we touch, the values we pass on. My father's legacy isn't Phoenix Innovations. It's what he taught Tom, what Tom taught Peter, and what Peter will someday teach others." As if hearing his name, Peter came running back to them, his face alight with excitement. "I got the perfect picture. Can we put it in the workshop next to the one of Dad and Grandpa Chen?" "Absolutely," Richard said, ruffling the boy's hair. "It belongs there with the family." Together, the three of them walked out of the cemetery toward the future, a future none of them could have imagined that day when a billionaire CEO found a little boy at his father's tomb and froze at what he said. A chance encounter had healed old wounds, connected lost pieces of a family puzzle, and reminded a successful man what true success really meant. And somewhere, Richard liked to think, his father and Tom were nodding in approval.